Los Angeles, early 1962. Daylight. Too many cameras, too close, too quiet in the gaps between shutter clicks. Marilyn Monroe stands at the hotel entrance, smiling. Not at people, but at lenses. The smile is precise, calibrated, flawless. Her hands are shaking. No one notices. Someone shouts her name. Someone tells her to turn her shoulder. Someone laughs, a second too loud. The cameras tighten their circle. Then it happens. A hand touches her elbow, not pulling, not posing, no words, no warning. For a fraction of a second, the rhythm breaks. The lenses hesitate, and Marilyn is gone from the frame. Standing beside her is a man no one expected to see there. Not her publicist, not her protector by contract, not a man chasing headlines or rumors. Dean Martin. He doesn't smile for the cameras. He doesn't explain himself. He doesn't look back. He simply takes her one step away from the light. At the time, no one understands what they just missed. Later, it will become clear. This was never a love story. It was a boundary, drawn once, quietly, by the only person that day who saw not a legend, but a woman running out of room to breathe. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. By the early months of 1962, Marilyn Monroe no longer belonged to herself. Not in the way people imagine when they talk about fame, contracts, or studio pressure. It was more invasive than that. Her face, her voice, even the pauses between her words had become public property. Everyone felt entitled to them. Very few noticed what it was costing her. After the misfits, her body never quite caught up with her legend. Exhaustion lingered in her bones. Hospital rooms replaced dressing rooms with alarming regularity. Doctors spoke in careful tones, handing over prescriptions that were meant to stabilize, but often did the opposite. Studios, once eager to build schedules around her, began speaking about her in meetings as a risk, a word that carried more weight than any diagnosis. None of this reached the public. To them, she was still glowing, still laughing, still Marilyn. Outside a Manhattan building that afternoon, the air vibrated with anticipation. Cameras were already raised before she appeared. The sound came first, shutters snapping in uneven bursts, overlapping like nervous breathing. When she stepped into view, the noise intensified, closing in on her from every direction. Photographers shouted not to be heard, but to provoke. They knew which words landed hardest. "Marilyn, look here. Smile, just one more. Is it true you're working again?" She offered what was expected, a practiced curve of the lips, a tilt of the head. It took effort now, visible only if you knew where to look. The slight delay before she responded, the tension in her shoulders that never quite relaxed. Then someone said his name. Joe. DiMaggio. It wasn't a question. It was tossed out casually, almost lazily, by a photographer who had learned that pain made better pictures than beauty. For a fraction of a second, the expression slipped. Not tears, not anger. Something closer to panic, quickly buried under instinct. Cameras surged forward, sensing weakness the way sharks sense blood. Across the sidewalk, Dean Martin stopped walking. He hadn't come for this. He was there for a private meeting, nothing public, nothing meant to involve crowds or flashes. He recognized the scene immediately, not the woman, but the mechanism around her. The way the lenses formed a wall, the way the noise pressed inward. He'd spent his life inside that machinery. He knew what it did to people who couldn't step out of it. When he looked at Marilyn, he didn't see the icon. He saw fatigue sharpened into alertness, eyes scanning for escape while the rest of her body stayed obediently still. No one else seemed to notice. Or perhaps they did. and chose not to. Dean didn't wave, didn't call out her name. He didn't smile for the cameras or acknowledge them at all. He simply watched long enough to understand something important. She wasn't being photographed. She was being cornered. The shutters kept firing. The crowd leaned closer, and in the middle of it, Marilyn Monroe stood exactly where the world wanted her, while quietly running out of space to breathe. Dean didn't announce himself. That would have turned the moment into theater, and theater was exactly what was crushing her. Instead, he moved with the unremarkable certainty of someone used to crowded rooms. One step forward, then another, until his back filled the narrow space between Marilyn and the cameras. The effect was immediate. Shouts sharpened. A few photographers cursed under their breath. This wasn't part of the arrangement. Access depended on predictability, and Dean Martin was breaking it without saying a word. He didn't raise a hand, didn't signal security. He simply stood there, close enough that the flashes struck his shoulders instead of her face. "Hey, Dean! Don't do this!" someone yelled. Another voice followed, louder, edged with irritation. "This doesn't look good." He heard them. Of course he did. Tomorrow's papers could twist this into whatever shape sold best. Possessive, arrogant, inappropriate. He had spent decades watching stories grow teeth overnight. He understood the risk clearly, and still, he didn't move aside. Marilyn hesitated. The instinct drilled into her over years told her to stay put, to keep smiling, to finish the ritual. But the noise was now slightly muted, as if someone had lowered the volume without turning it off. She looked at his back, then at the narrow gap he'd created. No invitation, no pressure, just an opening. She took it. They moved together, not hurried, not dramatic. The crowd surged forward, but the moment had already slipped out of their hands. Inside the building, the sound collapsed into something manageable. Footsteps, a closing door, breath returning to a natural rhythm. The corridor smelled faintly of polish and old paper. Ordinary. Grounded. In the elevator, the doors slid shut with a dull finality. Silence replaced the chaos so abruptly it felt unreal. Marilyn didn't reach for the mirror. She didn't adjust her hair. For the first time that day, she let her face rest. Dean stood beside her, eyes forward, hands loose at his sides. He gave her space even here. No questions, no reassurance offered for applause. Halfway down, she spoke, barely above the hum of the cables. "Thank you," she said, then paused. "For not looking." He turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge her without invading the moment. The elevator continued its descent. Outside, cameras were already repositioning, searching for the next angle. Inside that small, moving box, there was nothing to perform. Just two people standing still, letting the noise stay behind them for as long as the ride allowed. They didn't go far. That was intentional. Distance would have turned the escape into a statement, and neither of them wanted one. A quiet lounge off the main corridor offered anonymity without isolation. Muted lights, upholstered chairs that had held too many private negotiations to remember any of them. The door closed softly. No lock, no guard. Dean took the chair opposite hers, leaving enough space that she could leave first if she wanted. He didn't lean forward, didn't ask if she was all right. Those questions carried expectations, and he sensed she had nothing left to perform. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't heavy. It was cautious, as if both were listening for the world to break in again. Marilyn exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes after holding it for too long. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers still. almost formal. When she finally looked up, there was no trace of the woman from the sidewalk. "I don't know how long I can keep being wanted," she said. The word sounded technical, stripped of glamour. Not loved, wanted. Dean nodded once. No interruption, no correction. "They tell me I should be grateful," she continued. "And I am. I know what I've been given. But sometimes I can't tell if anyone sees me when the lights are off, or if I disappear with them." It wasn't self-pity. It was assessment. A clear-eyed inventory delivered without drama. That was what unsettled him most. After a pause, he spoke, choosing his words with care. "People think I don't feel things," he said. "They're wrong. I just learned early that showing it costs more than hiding it." Her gaze stayed on him, steady now. "So you pretend?" she asked. "I manage," he replied. "There's a difference." The clock on the wall ticked, loud enough to be noticed. Somewhere nearby, a phone rang and went unanswered. Time was still moving, whether they acknowledged it or not. Marilyn leaned back slightly. "I'm tired of being a shape," she said. "Every room already knows who I'm supposed to be before I arrive." Dean considered that, then said almost casually, "You don't owe every room a version of yourself." The sentence didn't land like wisdom. It sat there, plain and unadorned, waiting to be used or ignored. She absorbed it quietly, as if storing it away rather than reacting. When she stood, the moment didn't feel finished, only paused. At the door, she stopped. "This," she said, gesturing between them, "won't be remembered." Dean met her eyes. "Some things don't need witnesses." She nodded once, then stepped back into the world, unaware, as he was, that this unrecorded exchange would outlast most of what had ever been said about her. The hallway swallowed her again the moment the door eased open. Conversation snapped back into place like elastic. Assistants murmuring, shoes striking tile, someone calling her name too brightly. Marilyn's posture adjusted before she seemed to decide to do it, shoulders settling into the familiar alignment that photographers loved. The lounge had given her a handful of minutes without an audience. Outside it, the audience was waiting, impatient for proof she was still what they paid for. They didn't make it 10 steps before the first flash popped through the corridor opening, as if the building itself had been breached. A cluster of reporters had found the angle. They always did. The cameras were closer now, bolder, fueled by the scent of disruption. Where did she go? "Dean, what was that? Are you controlling her?" The words weren't accusations yet. They were invitations for a story to form. Marilyn didn't smile this time. Not at first. Her eyes flicked toward the noise with a guarded calculation, as though she were weighing whether the mask was even worth lifting. That hesitation, tiny, human, gave the photographers exactly what they wanted. They leaned in like men who sensed a crack in glass. Someone tried again, louder, sharper. Another name, another lever to pull. The crowd shifted, hunting for the reaction that would justify the chase. Dean didn't step back into the frame. He also didn't step in front of it again. Not here. Not with the corridor narrowing and too many people watching. He'd already broken the rules once today. Breaking them twice would turn into spectacle. And spectacle would eat her alive. An hour later, his manager caught him near the hotel lobby, voice low and urgent, as if even air could carry rumors. "You know what this turns into," the man said. "They'll spin it. Possessive, protective, something dirty. You've got dates, Vegas, sponsors. Don't attach yourself to a collapsing headline." Dean listened without arguing. He didn't have to. He knew the business math. One photograph could cost a contract, One sentence could sour a booking. The manager waited for the nod, for the easy promise of distance. Dean gave neither. He simply said, "I heard you," and let the conversation die there. By evening, the gossip had already begun crawling through phone lines. A columnist's assistant called a studio publicist. A bartender repeated a half-seen moment to a producer. The story grew teeth with every retelling. Dean Martin, stepping in, Marilyn Monroe, following, the implication forming before anyone checked whether it was true. What made it worse was his silence. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain. He didn't offer a charming quote to blunt the edge. To the public, that quiet looked suspicious, like a man hiding something. To the people who knew him, it meant something else. He refused to make her situation into his performance. 2 days later, outside another building, a smaller swarm waited. The air was colder. The impatience wasn't. Marilyn appeared at the top of a short staircase, and the shouting began instantly. Her face arranged itself out of habit, but the brightness didn't reach her eyes. It was all effort now, a practiced movement over a mind that wanted to fold inward. She took one step down, then paused as the cameras surged closer than they should have been allowed. And then, as if the city itself had shifted, a side door opened behind her. Not loudly, not ceremoniously. An older doorman made a subtle gesture, almost dismissive, as though inviting her away from an inconvenience. No crowd followed. No one noticed until she was already gone. There was no proof Dean arranged it. No public credit. No whispered brag. Just a quiet corridor, a short walk, and a car positioned where the lenses couldn't reach. Marilyn slid into the back seat without looking up. The door closed, sealing out the noise. Through the window, the flashes still fired, catching nothing but reflections. For a moment, her hand hovered near the glass as if she might touch it, then dropped, tired, to her lap. The driver pulled away, and somewhere behind them, the crowd kept shouting at an absence, already angry that the easiest version of her had slipped beyond their reach. The changes didn't arrive as a collapse. They came as inconveniences, small disruptions that were easy to excuse if you needed the machine to keep running. She arrived late to a rehearsal and apologized too quickly, words tripping over one another as if she'd practiced them in advance. On set, she forgot a line she had known for years, laughed it off, blamed the lighting, the schedule, the room. Someone handed her a script with fresh pages marked in pencil, and she stared at it longer than necessary before nodding. No one pressed. No one wanted to be the person who slowed things down. Between takes, her moods shifted without warning. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough to make the air uncertain. A sudden brightness that faded too fast. A quiet stretch where she answered questions with polite precision, eyes fixed somewhere behind the wall. Assistants traded looks and rationalized it the way they always had. She was tired. She was sensitive. She was Marilyn. Dean noticed the timing, the pattern, the way these moments clustered closer together. He saw it in her hands most clearly. They no longer rested. They waited. Fingers tapping once, then stopping, as if corrected by an internal voice. When she laughed, it ended abruptly, like a switch flipped by someone else. These weren't the signs people expected from tragedy. They were subtler, easier to dismiss, harder to unsee. They spoke on the phone once that week. Not long. No greetings worth remembering. "I'm fine," she said before he could ask. The phrase landed flat, rehearsed to the point of exhaustion. "Everything's under control." He listened past the words. The rhythm told him more than the sentence. There was no conviction there, only habit. as if saying it enough times might eventually make it true. "I'm glad," he replied, carefully neutral. He didn't contradict her. He didn't reassure her either. Pushing would have closed the line. He understood that boundary now. There were things he could have done, people he could have called, doors that might have opened if he leaned hard enough. He weighed each option and felt the same resistance every time, not from the world, but from her. Help offered too loudly became another spotlight. Concern expressed too urgently felt like control. He refused to turn into another force pressing in. To outsiders, his restraint looked like indifference. He wasn't photographed near her anymore. He didn't reference her in interviews. When her name surfaced in conversation, he let it pass without embellishment. A columnist wrote that he'd lost interest. Someone else suggested he'd been advised to keep his distance. Neither story bothered him enough to correct. What troubled him were the pauses between updates. The way news of her arrived indirectly, stripped of detail. A missed appearance here, a delayed meeting there. Always explained, always smoothed over before it could harden into concern. One afternoon, he caught sight of her across a studio lot. She didn't see him. She stood alone near a soundstage door, coat pulled tight despite the mild weather. For a moment, she looked smaller than he remembered, not physically, but in presence, as if she were receding while still standing in place. He considered walking over, just a few steps. He didn't. He knew that crossing that distance would not fix what was happening. It might even fracture something fragile she was still holding together. Respect, sometimes, meant staying back when every instinct argued otherwise. As he turned away, a thought settled in. Unwelcome, unspoken, but persistent. Whatever protection he'd offered before, however brief, might already belong to the past. And if something was coming, something no one wanted to name, then the quiet moments, the small mercies, the space he'd helped create might have been the last real shelter she'd been given. The first call came late, when the city had already thinned into streetlights and distant engines. Not a headline, not an announcement, just a voice on the other end of a line that sounded careful, as if every word might shatter something. "Have you heard anything?" the caller asked. Dean stood in his kitchen, with the receiver pressed to his ear, the other hand resting on the counter. He didn't turn on more lights. He didn't need them. He could feel the hour in the stillness. "Hear what?" he said. A pause, a swallow. "There's talk. Something happened. Out in Los Angeles. No name, no specifics. Only the shape of fear, kept deliberately vague." Dean asked one question, slow and even. "Who told you?" The answer was a chain. Someone at a studio, someone who knew someone in the hills, someone who'd seen police outside a gate. Nothing solid, yet too many links to be ignored. When the line went dead, Dean didn't move right away. He stared at the phone as if it might ring again, with a sentence that changed everything back. It did ring again, and again. Each call carried the same strange restraint. People spoke in fragments, lowering their voices even though no one else was in the room. They described it as an emergency, an incident, a situation. They avoided the obvious word the way superstitious gamblers avoid saying "lost" until the cards are on the table. In another part of the industry, the night had already turned practical. Publicists were awake. Producers were awake. Men in clean shirts sat at desks with ashtrays filling beside them, thinking not about grief, but about timing. If the rumor was wrong, they needed to smother it. If it was right, they needed to control the first wave. One studio executive was overheard saying, "No statements until we know what we're dealing with." Another muttered, "If it breaks on our terms." Even sympathy in that world required strategy. The quiet wasn't compassion. It was calculus. Dean heard none of those conversations directly. He felt them, though, in the way people spoke to him. Polite, restrained, as if emotion itself might be used as evidence later. Near midnight, a call came from someone he trusted, a voice that never chased gossip. "It's serious," the man said. "They're not confirming anything yet." Dean closed his eyes. "Where are you?" "Back east, but I've got people calling me. They're saying it might be her." Dean didn't ask for the name. Not because he didn't want it, but because he couldn't bear hearing it from a rumor. He asked something else instead, something that cut through all the noise. When was she last seen? The answer wasn't clean. A date, maybe. A vague reference to a house. Mentions of staff, of doctors, of a locked door. Each detail arrived wrapped in uncertainty. Dean listened without interrupting. When the man finished, there was nothing left to say. Condolences would have been premature, and optimism would have been dishonest. After he hung up, he stood alone in the dim room while the refrigerator clicked softly, cycling like a heartbeat. Outside, a car passed, tires whispering on pavement. Ordinary sounds, unchanged by whatever was unfolding across the country. He poured a drink and didn't touch it. In the hours before dawn, the industry kept its mouth shut while preparing its headlines. Phones stayed busy. Typewriters waited. People rehearsed sentences they would deliver with solemn faces once the facts were public. Dean remained in the same place, holding the receiver again when it rang, letting each caller speak around the name they feared to say. He offered no performance, no quotable pain, only a steady voice and the same question returning like a drumbeat. "Tell me when. Tell me who was there." Because in that night of profitable silence, the thing that haunted him most was not the rumor itself. It was the possibility that, at the very end, she had been surrounded again, not by cameras this time, but by emptiness. By morning, the silence had become impossible to maintain. Radios carried the news in voices trained for gravity. Newspapers rushed out early editions, ink still damp, names printed larger than the truth could ever be. By noon, the cameras were back in position, hungry again, this time for grief. They lined sidewalks and gates, pointed toward places that would never answer them. Marilyn Monroe was no longer a woman in crisis. She was a headline. Dean read none of it. He didn't turn on the television. He didn't return the calls piling up beside the phone, each one offering a chance to be seen reacting. Publicists wanted a sentence. Reporters wanted a memory. Everyone wanted him to stand somewhere visible and say something gentle enough to quote. He refused all of it. To the industry, his absence looked cold. Some took it as confirmation of distance, others as guilt, others still as calculation. They were wrong in different ways. Dean wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting something smaller, more fragile, the last private outline of a woman who had been consumed by being looked at. What he did instead never appeared in print. He made a call that afternoon to a man who handled things quietly, without paperwork that led to press leaks. The request was simple, almost mundane. No announcements, no photographers, no guests who didn't need to be there. He asked for restraint, not ceremony. Later, he arranged for a package to be delivered. Personal effects that had been mishandled in the rush returned to where they belonged. He made sure one particular item didn't end up cataloged or auctioned. It was nothing valuable in the public sense. It mattered because it had been hers. There were no witnesses. That was the point. Days passed. The world argued over causes, over responsibility, over meanings it could digest. Speculation filled the space where understanding should have been. The myth expanded even in death, smoother and easier than the truth ever was. Dean went back to work. On stage, he sang as he always had, measured, controlled, letting the room have what it came for without giving away more. If anyone expected a crack in the voice, they didn't get it. Grief, for him, had never been loud. Years later, long after the frenzy had burned itself out, a detail surfaced by accident. Not in a memoir, not in an interview. It slipped out through a second-hand recollection, mentioned without emphasis by someone who hadn't realized it mattered. A small kindness, done early, done privately, that made one terrible moment slightly less exposed. The story didn't spread far. It wasn't sensational enough. What remained was something quieter. That day in the lounge, the sentence he'd offered without decoration. The idea that a person did not owe every room a version of themselves, that some moments were allowed to exist without proof. In the end, amid hundreds of thousands of photographs, the most faithful act left no image behind. And perhaps that was the truest way he ever saw her. Not as a legend to be preserved, but as a woman who, once, had been gently led out of the light. Nothing captured it. Nothing needed to.